Now earlier, when I was giving a brief synopsis as to what transpired in the film, I mentioned that Gideon, Harriet Tubman's master, ultimately saved her from the clutches of Bigger Long. I also mentioned that he had confessed his love to her and set her free at the end of the film. Now I have a serious problem with this narrative for two reasons. For starters, it's a goddamn lie. Two, it takes away from Harriet Tubman's story as she never needed and had a white savior to help her out of slavery. And three, it's completely egregious. Much like Bigger Long, there is no historical record of Harriet Tubman being saved by her racist slave owner or by any person by the name of Gideon Brodess. And on top of that, does anyone honestly believe that a plantation owner would go out of their way to save their slave, especially during that time period? Now, contrary to what Hollywood would have you believe, no one, and I mean no one on those plantations could afford to lose a slave, especially around the 1800 time period. Now, what history won't tell you is that around the time that Harriet lived, slave breeding farms were in full effect. And for the people at home who don't know what slave breeding farms are, allow me to explain. Like the name suggests, slave breeding farms were a way for slave owners to replenish their Negro workforce due to the abolishment of slavery and the reduction of slaves coming from Africa. At the breeding farms, enslaved African men were forcefully made to sleep with enslaved African women to get them pregnant. On a daily basis, the men were forced to have sex with about 6 to 7 women in a day. The slave owners did not care if the women were the mothers, sisters, or cousins of the men. They just mated them like animals. This was the origin of the word motherfucker. Many of the men died in the breeding farms due to sexual exhaustion. In addition to that, plantation owners also raped their slaves with the sole purpose of getting them pregnant. When this happened, the plantation master would either place his own child in the field to work or sell them in the market. It was as simple as that. And for the people at home who think I'm making all of this up, allow me to read an excerpt from Birthing a Slave, Motherhood and Medicine. As of 1808, when Congress ended the nation's participation in the international slave trade, planters could no longer import additional slaves from Africa or the West Indies. The only practical way of increasing the number of slave laborers was through new births. With so much at stake, black women's reproductive roles became politically as well as economically decisive. If enslaved mothers did not bear sufficient numbers of children to take the place of aged and dying workers, the South could not continue as a slave society. And if that's not enough proof for you, here's another excerpt. Begin, quote, "As long as slave power continued to grow, breeders could literally bank on future demand and increasing prices. This made slaves not just a commodity, but the closest thing to money white breeders had. By a conservative estimate, in 1860, the total value of American slaves was $4 billion, far more than the gold and silver circulating nationally. At the time, slaves were worth more than anything slave masters could possibly imagine." And for my viewers at home who want to know just how much slaves were valued in the South during that time period, the number was $4 billion. And that number doesn't even include the crops that were being produced by the slaves for their plantation. If we factor that in, the number would increase to $1.92 billion. And for the sake of conversation, let's look at the North, shall we? In the North, around that time period, the total value of gold and silver in circulation was $228.3 million. So as you can clearly see, there was a huge economic disparity between the North and the South. This is what eventually led to the Emancipation of Proclamation, but that's a video for another time. Now, why is this important and what relevance does this have to the Harriet Tubman film? Well, that's pretty simple. Because Europeans could no longer import slaves from Africa, the only way that slave owners could count on future economic growth, i.e. payment, was if female slaves gave birth to more children. These children were used to replace the older dying slaves, and according to modern academia and the excerpts that I just read above, in the South, you could obtain more money from selling slaves than you could obtain running an entire farm producing and selling crops. And again, it should also be noted that the total number of slaves in the South was valued higher than the total gold and silver in America. Slavery was the most valuable commodity on the continent. This lends credence to what I had originally stated before. No white slave master would allow his or her slave to go free, especially when slavery was so lucrative. It just wouldn't happen. Allowing even a single slave to leave would be equivalent to letting $15,000 of your own money go today, as that's what a slave would be worth in 2019. In addition to that, you have to remember that the average woman who was a slave at that time period was required to give birth to 15 kids before she was even allowed to be free. This would bring the total value to $225,000 in today's money. Now, on top of that, it was stated in Harriet Tubman's very own autobiography that she freed anywhere from 200 to 300 slaves. And for the sake of conversation today, we're going to go with the higher number, 300. That would be equivalent to $4.5 million in today's money. $15,000, which was what each slave was worth, times 300 slaves gives you $4.5 million. So now that we all know this, I want to take the time to ask my viewers at home a serious question. Do you believe for an instant that Harriet Tubman's master, Gideon, who was making $4.5 million from slavery, would save Harriet Tubman and allow her to leave with $4.5 million of his money? Does that even sound logical? The answer is hell no.